250,000, give or take. That's how many people living in these 5 boroughs help make New York City a beacon of cultural diversity and opportunity. But it's taken us hundreds of years to get to this point. There was a time when New York owned more slaves than any other city except Charleston. In 1703, nearly half of all New York households owned slaves. And by the mid-1700s, 1 in 5 residents in this burgeoning metropolis were slaves. Looking around the city today, that history seems long forgotten. But as Americans, this idea of an underground railroad inspires us. These stories of survival, the narrow escapes, and the image of different races uniting for a common goal, it's empowering. Maybe that's why the premiere of Underground on WGN America shattered TV records.
Oh, Lord, praise in our come.
New York native Amirah Vann plays Ernestine, Underground's fierce matriarch who remains on the plantation after 7 fearless slaves embark on a 600-mile journey from Georgia to freedom.
I stand a little taller to know the investment and the price that was paid here.
At the epicenter of modern industry on Wall Street and Pearl Street lies the site of New York's first slave market. The Dutch introduced slavery to New Amsterdam, now Manhattan, in 1626, establishing New York's 2-centuries-long history with enslavement. So it was right there between Pearl and Water Street.
I didn't learn this in school at all. I didn't know anything about, you always get taught that like the Northern was the free states.
New African slaves arrived near what is now the South Street Seaport. They were auctioned off at this slave market between 1711 and 1762.
I did not realize that hallowed ground was so near to home for me. And so to be here, I thank you to just kind of know this and to share this.
In 1653, slaves built a massive wall to protect the Dutch from attack, a wall that stretched from the Hudson to the East River, where Wall Street is today. The same hands would help build the first City Hall and Trinity Church. Still, New York's earliest black citizens were outcasts from society and laid to rest outside city lines in an African burial ground that was excavated in 1991.
To realize that so many people helped build Lower Manhattan,
yes.
It's like, that's fantastic. That's the legacy that we come from, which is what our show Underground tries to share.
She wasn't even supposed to run.
Wasn't supposed to? What was supposed to happen? Tell me everything you know.
Take me back to the day that the Underground script comes across your desk. You get to meet Miss Ernestine for the first time.
Man.
What did you think?
The idea of playing an enslaved person was just like, is that how we want to be portrayed? And I was a part of that mentality of just like, no, sweep it under the rug.
I think about all kinds of lives. Like picking my fingers bloody out in them cotton fields, or being put up on that block, sold away from my chillin', maybe deep south to a breeding farm where they forced me to have a dozen babies I never get to hold.
And once I read the scripts, Misha and Joe are just such brilliant writers. I said, oh, this is something different. And I felt that angle immediately of empowerment.
Yes.
And I said, this is something I want to be a part of.
When Ernestine's daughter, Rosalie, played by Journey Smollett Bell, decides to run, Ernestine remains behind and is forced to make excruciating choices.
Do whatever I can to protect my daughter. I know you understand that.
I do.
The idea that our only option for the survival of our child is to take out a sister, is pretty devastating. Everyone says, how do you open up your heart to it? And it's moments like this when you say, you have to give it your all. They deserve our all.
The heroic stories of the Underground Railroad are steeped in conjecture and legend because there's very little record of what actually happened. We do know it wasn't an actual railroad beneath the Earth's surface. It was more like a network of safe houses and activists that facilitated the freedom of some 30,000 slaves, and by some estimates, even 100,000. To learn more about what the Underground Railroad was really like, we can actually start right here in Brooklyn.
This church was established in 1847 and it later became known as the Grand Central Depot of the Underground Railroad.
Plymouth Church hid fugitive slaves who escaped through the Northeast Corridor. It's one of the few sites still standing, mapped out in Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Eric Foner's acclaimed book, Gateway to Freedom: The Hidden History of the Underground Railroad. Stacy Toussaint offers guided tours of this and other abolitionist landmarks of New York City.
We have to remember that the Underground Railroad really started in the 1780s, but it reached its height in the 1830s to the 1850s. Slavery was abolished in New York in 1827, but this was still a very pro-slavery city because of the economic benefit that slavery was bringing. We have to remember that slavery was a $4 billion industry. It was actually worth more financially than all of American manufacturing put together. And New York was the place that much of the cotton coming in, the other products would come into New York City. An enslaved person was in danger in New York, but also free people were in danger because free people were worth quite a bit, and they would often be kidnapped. Once they kidnapped you, you didn't have any rights before the law. These people were risking everything in order to be set free.
As Plymouth Church's first pastor, Henry Ward Beecher established its anti-slavery philosophy, publicly opposing the atrocities of slavery, working alongside black and white abolitionists to aid fugitives.
Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you could get 6 months in jail or a $1,000 fine for helping an enslaved person escape.
Because Henry Ward Beecher was violating the Fugitive Slave Act, there's very little documentation that would tell us exactly how many slaves might have passed through here. But we believe this basement is the area where he kept them.
There was a trauma of being kidnapped in Africa. There was a trauma of the Middle Passage where you were put in very small spaces for weeks at a time. There was a trauma of the slave forts, which were these huge forts where you were held before you were sold into slavery. So we have to imagine that being in a space like this, even though it was a place of salvation, would have been very difficult for an enslaved person. Most people did not have a conductor, so you had to rely on your wits and the kindness of strangers. There was an enslaved woman who actually came through New York who spent 7 years hiding in an attic. People did everything they could to escape enslavement.
How long would a slave stay in one place on the Underground Railroad?
It would vary. It would depend on the safety of the location and whether the location was compromised. We do know that sometimes Plymouth Church was compromised and they might bring them to somewhere else.
And Harriet Tubman was escorting slaves to Canada. So here in New York City, this might have been a place where they might have come on their way to Canada.
Certainly, Canada was the one safe place because we do know that there were paid slave hunters who would track enslaved people down, capture them, and bring them back to certainly often a violent fate if they were captured. So they had a lot to be afraid of escaping.
Something so surreal about being here at Harriet Tubman's home and knowing that where I'm walking, she also walked.
History remembers Harriet Tubman as a hero of the Underground Railroad. She escaped from slavery on foot, but bravely returned to the South again and again and again, rescuing some 50 to 100 slaves when all was said and done. She retired here at her home in Auburn and established the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged.
Ken, how does it feel to be here on this property?
Well, I actually have chills. This is my second visit over the past 2 weeks. And to walk on this hallowed ground where the great Harriet Tubman lived, and to know that her house is over here and the home that she set up for the aged is right here, it is really something that I feel very honored because we walk in the shoes of those that came before us and we stand on their shoulders.
Ken Morris is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, the celebrated author and abolitionist who secured his own freedom to become the most influential black leader of the 19th century.
He had no family, he had no home, and he had no country, but in spite of all of that, through teaching himself to read and write, he was able to overcome those seemingly insurmountable obstacles and rise up to effect change in the lives of millions of people.
In 1838, Frederick embarked on a perilous journey out of bondage in Baltimore through the Underground Railroad to freedom in New York. If his wife and Ken's great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray, hadn't encouraged him to run, history might have been very different today.
She said to Frederick, "You're not meant to be a slave." And she was really the first person that planted this seed of thought in his mind. So now in 1838, on September 3rd, when he finally makes the decision to run away, she sews a disguise for him, which was a sailor's outfit.
He arrived safely in New York at the home of David Ruggles, whom many believe to be New York's most radical black abolitionist. Ruggles confronted slavery in his writings and through courageous acts of civil disobedience. By some estimates, Ruggles personally helped hundreds of runaways here at his house at 36 Lispenard Street in modern-day Tribeca.
He would help them get to the next station or the next stop on the Underground Railroad.
Later, Frederick Douglass detailed his escape in best-selling autobiographies, becoming a famous anti-slavery lecturer and advisor to President Lincoln.
He understood right then and there that knowledge was power and it would be his key to freedom. This is Harriet Tubman's home.
In a few years, Tubman is getting a new home on the face of the $20 bill.
Frederick said in a letter to Harriet that I worked in the public and the light and I got all of these accolades, and you worked at night, and really what you received from these trembling souls is a thank you and a God bless you.
Today, Ken Morris carries on the legacy of his great-great-great-grandfather.
So there are millions that are still enslaved around the world, living in conditions as horrific as the slavery that my ancestor suffered through and endured. I felt like I could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this.
That's when Ken and his mother, Nettie Washington Douglass, founded the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives to fight against human trafficking.
So we work to educate the public about the existence of slavery today, and we do that where education should start, and that's with young people.
And here we are, in a nation that is still filled with so much injustice and pain. I just wish that I could go back and ask these American heroes, what do we do now? How do we fix this? Then again, I think Frederick Douglass said it all when he said, "It is easier to build strong
children than to repair broken men."